Welcome to another episode where we explore real-life encounters that will send chills down your spine. Today, we're diving into stories from one of the most unsettling places of all, schools. Schools are supposed to be places of learning and safety, but sometimes, the walls of these old buildings hold more than just memories. The following stories are first-hand accounts of eerie and unexplained events that took place in schools. No fiction, no exaggeration, just pure, terrifying reality. So sit back, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for these chilling tales from classrooms, hallways, and forgotten corners. Let's begin. The old school building, a haunting experience. I used to work as a janitor in a small town, and one of my regular assignments was maintaining the local high school. This wasn't just any high school, though. Part of the building was old, very old. It had been there since the early 1900s, and while most of the classrooms had been updated over the years, the basement and some of the upper levels remained untouched. Everyone in town had heard stories about that school, more specifically, about its old wing. It was said that a student had died there decades ago, back in the 1950s. The details were always fuzzy, but the general idea was that she had fallen down a flight of stairs. Some said it was an accident, others whispered about something darker. Regardless, it became a local legend, and over time, people started reporting strange occurrences in that part of the building. I never paid much attention to these stories. I had been working there for over a year and hadn't experienced anything unusual. But then, one night, something happened that changed my mind completely. It was a Friday night, and I had stayed late to clean up after a school event. By the time I finished, it was well past 11 p.m., and the school was completely empty. Most of the lights were off, and the long hallways were eerily silent. My last task for the night was to lock up the old wing of the school. The minute I stepped into that part of the building, I felt it. The air was different, heavier, colder. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. There was no one else there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my imagination and the fact that I was tired. But as I approached the stairwell that led down to the basement, I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft whispering sound, almost like someone speaking just out of earshot. I stopped in my tracks and listened closely, but the noise stopped as soon as I focused on it. I told myself it was just the old building settling. I had heard strange sounds before, pipes creaking, floors shifting. It was an old place, after all. But as I continued down the hallway, the whispering returned. This time it was louder, clearer, and there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was talking. I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the hallway was empty. My heart started racing, and I hurried down the stairs to lock up the basement as quickly as I could. As I reached the bottom step, I heard a loud bang behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty stairwell. I told myself again that it was just the building, maybe a door slamming shut from a draft. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I quickly locked the basement door and started to head back upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the basement behind me. I froze. There was no one else in the building. I was certain of that. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned around and shined my flashlight down the stairwell. The light flickered slightly, and that's when I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, just outside the basement door, was a shadowy figure. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, standing perfectly still, facing me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette in the dim light. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. It didn't walk away, it didn't fade out, it simply disappeared. I didn't waste any more time. I ran out of that wing as fast as I could, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I didn't stop until I was back in the main part of the school, where the lights were still on, and the air felt lighter. The next day, I went to work as usual. I didn't mention what had happened to anyone, who would believe me, anyway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that building that night was still there, watching, waiting. Over the next few weeks, I tried to avoid the old wing as much as possible. But every time I had to go back there, I could feel it, the heaviness, the cold, the sense of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, when the school was empty and quiet, I could still hear the whispering. I eventually left that job and moved on to something else, but I'll never forget that night. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know what was down in that basement. But I do know one thing, I'll never set foot in that old building again. The locked classroom. There's an old classroom in the high school I used to attend. It's located on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway that hardly anyone used. The room had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. No teachers held classes there, no one went inside, and no one seemed to know why. Over the years, it became the subject of countless rumors. Some said a teacher had died there. Others claimed that the room was cursed, and anyone who entered would never come back out. I never believed any of it. They were just stories kids told to scare each other. But there was something about that room, about that whole hallway, that always felt off. Even when I was just passing by, I couldn't help but notice the strange stillness in the air, like the rest of the school was moving and breathing, but that hallway was frozen in time. One day, after school, my friend Mark dared me to try and open the door. We were the last 2 students in the building, waiting for our parents to pick us up, and with nothing else to do, I accepted the challenge. I wasn't scared. After all, I figured the door was probably just locked because the room wasn't being used. We made our way up to the 3rd floor. The school was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights. As we walked down the hallway towards the old classroom, I felt a strange uneasiness creeping up on me. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sense that something wasn't right. I brushed it off, not wanting to seem like a coward in front of Mark. When we reached the door, I hesitated for a second. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, just a plain wooden door with a small window at the top, covered by a layer of dust. But as I reached for the handle, I could feel the cold metal even before I touched it, as if the air around it was much colder than the rest of the hallway. I turned the handle, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it clicked open easily. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it, revealing a dark, empty classroom inside. It was just like any other room in the school, desks, chairs, a blackboard at the front, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had been in there for years. Mark and I stepped inside cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air was stale, and there was a faint, musty smell that made my stomach turn. I walked over to one of the windows to open it and let some air in, but no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, like it hadn't been opened in decades. That's when we heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, coming from the back of the room. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again, this time louder, closer. Mark and I froze, staring at each other in disbelief. We were the only ones in the building, or so we thought. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We turned to look towards the back of the room, where the sound had come from. There was nothing there, just more desks and chairs, all covered in dust. But then I saw it. One of the desks, the one in the far corner, was moving. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was definitely shifting, inching forward as if someone was sitting in it and pushing it from underneath. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one else in the room. That was impossible. Suddenly, the shuffling sound grew louder, more frantic, and the desk jerked forward violently, scraping against the floor. Mark grabbed my arm, and before I could react, we were both sprinting out of the room. I didn't even stop to close the door behind us. We ran all the way down the stairs, not saying a word until we reached the safety of the main hallway. I could barely catch my breath, my mind racing with what I had just seen. Mark was pale, his hands shaking. "You saw that, right?" I asked, still trying to make sense of it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But let's not talk about it. Ever." We never did talk about it again. We didn't have to. Whatever was in that room wasn't something we could explain, and we weren't about to go back and find out. The next day, I avoided the third floor altogether. I didn't want to go anywhere near that classroom. But as the weeks went by, I started to wonder if maybe we had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us, fueled by all the stories we'd heard over the years. But then something strange happened. A few weeks later, I was walking past the hallway where the classroom was, and I noticed something. The door, which had always been locked, was now chained shut, with a heavy padlock securing it in place. There was no explanation, no announcement from the school. It was just locked. Permanently. I asked one of the teachers about it, but they brushed me off, saying the room was unsafe and had been closed off for good. But I knew the truth. Whatever had been in that room was still there, waiting in the darkness, behind that locked door. And I wasn't about to be the one to let it out. The forgotten locker. I never thought much about the locker at the end of the hallway. It was one of those things you passed by every day without giving it a second thought. It sat there, unused, gathering dust, in a part of the school that was rarely visited. The school had been built over 50 years ago, and some of the older parts of the building felt like they belonged in a different era. That locker, in particular, always seemed out of place, like it had been forgotten by everyone, except for me. I only started noticing it during my senior year. I had been given a locker nearby after a schedule change, and I walked past it every morning. Unlike the other lockers, which were dull and scratched from years of use, this one was pristine. There wasn't a single mark on it, and its lock was still intact, though no one ever seemed to use it. One day, out of sheer curiosity, I decided to ask one of the janitors about it. Mr. Harris had worked at the school for decades, so if anyone knew the story behind it, it would be him. "That locker," he said, looking surprised. "No one's used that one in years. Not since the incident." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head, mumbling something about the past. He didn't seem willing to share any more details, but the way his face paled at the mention of that locker made me even more curious. Later that day, I asked around. Some of the older teachers vaguely remembered something about it, something about a student from years ago. The story wasn't clear, but from what I gathered, a girl had disappeared after leaving a note in that locker. It was a long time ago, and most of the details had been forgotten or mixed up with rumors. Some people claimed she ran away, others whispered about something much darker. I couldn't get the story out of my head. Every time I walked past that locker, I felt a strange pull, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. It didn't help that the hallway always felt colder around it, like the temperature dropped the closer you got. One evening, I stayed late to finish up some work for a project. The school was practically empty, and the silence in the building was unsettling. I was gathering my things when I heard it, a soft metallic click coming from the hallway. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just one of the janitors. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like someone fiddling with a locker. My curiosity got the better of me, and I went to investigate. The hallway was dimly lit, and as I approached the end where the forgotten locker was, I noticed something strange. The lock, which had always been firmly in place, was now hanging open. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill out from the gap. I stood there, frozen. No one had used that locker in years, so why was it open now? I reached out, my hand trembling, and slowly pulled the door open. Inside, there was nothing. Just an empty, dark space. But as I stared into the locker, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being watched. Then I noticed something at the very back of the locker. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but there was something scratched into the metal. I leaned in closer, squinting to make out the words. It was a name. the name of the girl who had disappeared all those years ago. Suddenly, the locker door slammed shut with a deafening bang, nearly catching my fingers. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the sound echoed down the empty hallway. I tried to open it again, but the lock had snapped back into place, as if it had never been opened in the first place. I didn't stick around to figure out what had just happened. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the school as fast as I could. The next day, I tried to tell a few friends about what I had seen, but they just laughed it off. "It's just a locker," they said. "You were probably imagining things." But I knew what I saw. And I wasn't the only one. A few weeks later, I overheard another student talking about the locker, how they had seen it open late one night, just like I had. We exchanged nervous glances but didn't say anything more. No one wanted to be the one to mess with whatever was happening in that part of the school. I never went near that locker again. And as far as I know, it's still there, at the end of the hallway, waiting. For what? I don't know. But sometimes, late at night, when the school is empty and silent, I wonder if it's still clicking open, just waiting for someone to take a look inside. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. These stories remind us that even the most familiar places, like schools, can hide eerie secrets and unexplainable occurrences. Whether it's a forgotten locker or an old classroom, the next time you walk through the halls, take a moment to listen, to watch, because you never know what might be lingering in the shadows. If you enjoyed these chilling encounters, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the unknown. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes, the scariest things are closer than you think.